On a prairie morning so cold the fire itself seemed to be giving up, two children cried a cry that stopped a rich man's horse. Weston Hale had ridden the boundary since he was old enough to saddle a saddle, and he had heard 100 sounds that told a man how the land was faring: wind in the rye, cattle calling, the distant thump of a bronc that would not settle. But nothing had prepared him for the small, raw twin wail that rose from the drifted hollow beside a broken wagon. It was the kind of sound that belonged to an empty cupboard and a thin blanket, to hands that had worked too long and lungs that had been coaxed into quiet with nothing left to coax with. It was a sound that made him dismount without thinking. The wagon lay on its side as if the prairie had simply grown tired of carrying it. A tattered canvas flapped like a tired flag. The small campfire was little more than a ring of black and soft wet embers, the kind that could not be encouraged back to life with a breath. The air smelled of frost and old tobacco. Weston's boots made small shore prints in the powdered grass as he moved closer. Two small faces turned toward him, one dull with sleep, one rimmed with the wet shine of tears, and a woman sat among them like a shipwrecked captain clinging to the last good provision. Her hands were full of work even as she sat. One cradled a child, the other smoothed a patch in a woolen sock. Her coat had seen better winters. The collar was turned up against the wind, but there was a sense about her as if she wore her dignity like an old shawl, worn but not to be discarded. He saw in the set of her jaw and the tilt of her head that she would rather go without than beg. Weston slid the edge of his coat from his shoulders and held it out. "You and the Barons will take cold," he said. She took the coat as if accepting a matter of fact. Her fingers brushed his when she did, rough from hard days but not unclean. "We're managing," she answered. Her voice had the careful cadence of someone who had been taught to measure words for economy. "Thank you for stopping, sir." He could have ridden on. There were fences to inspect, claim lines to follow, but he had not come this way to be a man who counted cattle before tending a cry. He found himself kneeling to tend the embers, and by the time he had coaxed a flame bright enough to warm fingers, 3 small bodies were warmed beneath his coat as well. The children's names came out in bits and small sounds. Tommy, who looked at Weston with the wary boldness of a child who has already been told the world is not to be trusted, and Jamie, who suckled close and blinked slow as if measuring the man by the sound of his pull. The woman, Delia Morgan, declined to speak much of what had made them drift across the prairie.
She said enough for a man to know that the dead hand of loss lay between them and any comfortable future. A husband named Samuel, gone. A wagon bound for a relative in town. A purse light as a church mouse. She showed him no papers then, only a small silver locket tucked under her blouse, cool against her skin like a private grief. Weston had known grief of his own, though it had taken a different form. Hale Ranch, though vast with grazing and hard-earned fences, was a place that had shaped him into someone who measured worth with a ledger as much as with a handshake. He had been taught to value land and the means to keep it. He had learned to keep the sort of quiet that pays its own bills. So perhaps it was the thing he had been missing, the interruption, when he nudged a decision that would not let him sleep comfortably until it had been made. "There's a house close by," he said finally. "Take you down to Hale, warm the boys up proper, get you some food. If you want, I'll see to a team to mend the wagon." Delia's eyes held something like suspicion, and then calculation. "I would not be a burden," she said. "You won't be a burden," Weston contradicted. "We have hands enough. Mrs. Henderson looks after us like we're all kin, whether we are or not. You'll do honest work if you wish. You're welcome." There was a quality to his welcome that had nothing to do with his name, and everything to do with the steadiness a man like him carried, an offer given as a matter of right rather than mercy. It struck something in her that was fainter than gratitude, the relief of dignity preserved. They rode the last mile with the twins tucked in blankets between them. The wires of frost on the prairie burned white and bright in the morning's thin light. Weston felt the easy eyes of his hands on the reins, the firm press of the saddle, and the slow building of a softness in his belly he had not named. He would later find that the thing that had stopped him was not just a cry, but a kind of summons to a life he had otherwise kept neatly compartmentalized. Hale Ranch rose from the prairie like a place that had been made to last. The big house was built of weathered boards and a stone foundation, the porch wide enough for several people to sit and contemplate a horizon that moved only with the seasons. Smoke bled from the kitchen chimney like good news. Children's laughter echoed from the nursery before they had even rounded the corner, as if the ranch itself was eager to take them in. Mrs. Henderson met them at the porch with a hot cloth and a bowl of broth. Her face was a map of years, and her voice was the kind that did not require softness to comfort. She peeled the twins from their mother's arms with the exact right measure of sternness and tenderness, and the boys settled as if put back in the right orbit.
Old Pete, a man whose face seemed to have been carved by the same winds that made the ridges of the land, appeared with 2 steaming mugs and a broad, approving grin. Cookie, soft-handed and salt-faced, brought extra blankets with the authority of someone who had known hard winters and was determined they did not repeat. Inside, Delea's hands moved with a quiet efficiency that did not betray how thin she felt beneath her clothes. People watched her with a curiosity that edged toward respect. She kept her back straight when they offered her a chair. She accepted the work Weston offered, not the charity that would have left a knot in her throat, but a job with pay, to help Mrs. Henderson keep the household ledger, to take in supplies and accounts, to balance what ought to be balanced. It was here, in the corner of the office where the light fell steady on a ledger's wire, that Weston saw the other part of the secret she had carried in her chest. He had expected hunger and cold. He had not expected the neatness of her handwriting in pen and ink, the certainty of columns that closed with the crisp satisfaction of an arithmetic resolved. She handled the ledger as if she had been taught in a crisp bank parlor rather than a kitchen table, numbers separated with the kind of restraint that told him of a past with a name like Mr. Morgan, not necessarily a man of cattle and fences, but a man with ledgers and claims of his own. She did not make a show of it. When a discrepancy occurred on the ranch's accounts, an old error of decimal and entry that had quieted a steady worry in Mrs. Henderson's brow, Delea corrected it with a sigh that held no pride, only the small relief of a thing put right. Weston watched her fingers treased over columns and felt the kind of admiration that was steady and not demonstrative. Later, when he asked where she had learned the skill, she gave him the short version: a banker's daughter's schooling, a husband who had trusted her to watch his books, an education that had gone quiet with Samuel's death. She produced the paper as easily as she would have drawn a handkerchief. It was a marriage certificate, not ornate, the edges worn as if it had been folded often and kept near the heart. The children's birth certificates were likewise modest, inked in a clerk's careful hand. There was a small locket, silver dulled by seasons, in which 2 tiny photographs resided, one of Samuel, stern and kind, the other of the twins months older, sleeping. She set them on the rough table and looked up at Weston as if saying, "There, now you know." "That's all?" he asked. "That's the secret?" She smiled, but it did not reach her eyes in the way a triumph would. "It's all I have to hide," she said. "I kept what proves what I must. The rest is pride." Weston considered the paper, the locket, the way she had guarded them from explanation but not from destruction. He had seen women trade their dignity for a roof. He had seen men do likewise, in other ways. There was something about the way she had chosen to preserve these things, for the boy's sake, not hers, that held him like a promise. That night, the nursery smelled of boiled starch and sun-warmed wool. The twins slept in a cot fashioned by old Pete, and Mrs. Henderson hummed a song older than any of them while she tucked a blanket under a small chin. The house settled in with a comfortable groan, and Weston stood in the doorway watching the 2 small chests rise and fall, as if he had embraced a different kind of land, one that changed you from the inside. If one scene makes a life change, it was perhaps the simplest. The way Weston sat at the kitchen table as dawn broke, the ledger open and a pen in his hand, and asked Delea to go over the accounts with him. She came to the table as if coming to a small altar. He listened to her find an inconsistency and adjust it, not with the brisk tone of a hired clerk, but with the tenderness of someone who cared for the order of things more than the power to command them. "Your columns ought not cross like that," she said once, gently. "It hides too much. Lead me through the horse feed, where it goes, what it should be. I'll find your place." Their working hours became small confidences. She began coming in early to the office with a cup of coffee and a pen, and he would arrive later, drawn by the sight of her methodical hand against the ledger's white.
In the afternoons, beneath a sinuous sky, he taught the twins to sit a pony in a way that kept their small knees safe and their eyes shining. She watched him in those moments with the kind of quiet that made her heartache less visible, as if she was mapping what it would feel like to trust again. The ranch hands, who had at first been wary of the newcomer, learned to make room for the twins' small interruptions. Cookie set aside a bowl of baked apples for Tommy's furtive joy. Old Pete carried the boys on his shoulders in the evenings, and they would laugh, a clean, startling sound that felt as if it might mend some of the cracks in a house that had known too many nights of worry. In these days, Weston watched things he had not intended to watch. The tilt of Delia's head when she read aloud to the twins from a thin book Mrs. Henderson brought in, the way she hummed as she stitched a sock, the small ritual of her opening the locket each time a letter came from the relative in town who might offer work or relief. He saw that she kept parts of herself private, not because she feared the gaze of others, but because some grief is a room one does not invite everyone into. Then came the fever. It began like a small thing, Jaime's hand, a little hotter than it should be, a breath that staggered on the inside of his chest. Delia noticed it first, her skilled hands learning the signs children carried when an illness was stealing in under their skin.
She brought him to the hearth and wrapped him close, whispering old remedies, sponge with vinegar, a warm poultice of flour and lint, the kind of domestic medicines that were as much comfort as cure. Weston, who had sat his share of vigil for cattle and for men, found himself pacing the nursery floor with hollow hands. He rode into town to fetch Dr. Ames, a distant figure who had seen a life of frontier illness and looked more like a man who counted heartbeats than a man who kept a ledger. The doctor came with a horse that snorted and a satchel that smelled of camphor. He sat down with a precise look and a slow, attentive hand. "It's a fever," Dr. Ames said without drama. "Keep him warm, keep him sweating, not shivering. Watch his tongue. If you lose him for an hour, send for me before sunup." Those were words that could have broken a woman into less than herself. Delia's face folded and then set with a determination that had nothing soft about it. She did not flinch. She held Jaime, moving with the rhythm of someone who has had to make courage from small routines. Weston sat by the bed, his big hands folded as if he could hold the air steady itself. He petitioned the land in a way men sometimes do, by doing. The night stretched, a long cobalt strip broken only by the lamp's thin pool of light. Delia hardly slept, blotting a brow and whispering to Jaime in a voice lowered by fear into the timbre of prayer. Weston sat and whittled, not out of habit, but to keep his hands busy and his mind from slipping into worse imaginings. He woke at one point and found himself standing by the bed, his back to the window where the wind wrote its own language across the glass. He placed the locket in Delia's palm without a word, a silent offering that said, "We are in this." When the sun finally came, leaking weak and gold across the nursery floor, Jaime's breathing had evened and the fever had begun to ebb. The relief in the house was a physical thing, like the slackening of ropes. Weston found that his relief was not only for the child, but for the woman hunched by the bed, her eyes rimmed red but strong, and in that relief something else took seed, a promise formed without language. He had kept his word, to offer shelter, to keep his hand steady. In keeping it, he found that the world he had planned was more open to amendment than his ledgers had suggested. In the days following, the relationship between them shifted by degrees. No sudden confessions, no brazen declarations. Instead, there was a small choreography. He sought her opinion on how best to lay out a pasture rotation. She told him which claim stocks should be thinned to save forage for winter. The boys began to call him Mr. Weston with a bright, fearless fondness that made the name a thing of tenderness rather than title. The ranch became a place where respect and affection were not mutually exclusive. Men who had once measured a person by the weight of his purse saw that the woman who kept the ledger had brought a steadiness to the house that steadied men too. Mrs. Henderson watched them with a small, approving smile and a propensity to grill a steak a bit longer when anyone seemed to need it. Old Pete told stories of his own wife and the way hands matter in keeping a house, as if to remind Delia she was not alone in the skills she had. Yet, beneath this slow growth of trust was the tremor of something else. The social orbit in which a woman like Delia moved would not remain unremarked for long. Word travels on prairie wind, and people in town spoke with the same curiosity they had always reserved for the movements of wealth. Weston himself knew the looks that could be sharp as a threshing blade. People who calculated not only how many acres you owned, but how well your name stood in a county's ledger of respectability. Victoria Ashworth was not a rumor, she was a presence. She had once been Weston's engagement, polished, precise, the sort of woman who fit the town's ledger and its social columns without troubling a line. Her family's name carried meaning: social gatherings on manicured lawns instead of late-night porches, dinners polished to a shine, and marriages that kept titles stout and measures even. Her return to the county had not been a surprise to those who tracked such comings and goings. What made her dangerous was not that she returned, but how particular she was in taking offense. Victoria came one bright afternoon, ribbon in her hair and the shadow of a smile practiced for drawing rooms. She arrived as if by necessity, with a petulant softness that was as cutting as any blade. The conversation began with pleasantries. How was the year's weather? How had the hay done? But the undertow was stinging. She made comments with a civility that left a sting, the sort of polite sentences that were sharpened by insinuation. "I was surprised to see such changes around your house, Weston," she said, the words like a hand that did not land on the seat, but instead brushed the edges of a more delicate area of his life. Weston had not meant to be defensive. "We took in some seekers," he said simply. "They're honest folk." Delia, for her part, met Victoria with a courtesy measured and exact. She offered no defense of her past and no bragging of her competence. Her silence was not timid, however. It was a boundary. Victoria, who had always been adept at prying at boundaries with the delicate tools of social pressure, proceeded to locate small things to question: the legitimacy of children, the propriety of a woman's works outside a home, the faint suggestion that a name without weight might stain a household standing. Victoria's remarks felt like pebbles into a pond. The circles reached farther than anyone expected.
Rumors gathered speed in town, and a county paper penned a few careless lines that would have been of little consequence were it not for the teeth behind them, suggestions that a man of Weston's standing might be at risk of losing not only face, but through complicated contracts and cloistered clauses, land. The mention of prenuptial agreements, an oddity in their part of the world but not unheard of, breathed new life into fearful speculation. It was a small seed that might sprout into a prairie fire given the right wind. Delia, aware of the rumor mill's appetite, retreated into herself in those days. She wrapped her grief and her dignity close and set to work in the ledger as if numbers might be armor. She kept the silver locket under her pillow at night and checked the marriage and birth papers as if the words might change by scrutiny. She wrote letters to the relative in town, not for money this time, but for counsel, and folded them with the old care of someone who had once been taught to mind detail. Weston saw the fragile lines of worry drawn around her mouth and decided, in the way he decided things, with a long look and a slower hand, not to let rumor dictate his life. He knew there would be consequences: social notices, whispers, perhaps even the kind of legal attention a man with enemies could summon. But the thought of sending Delia away because of fear felt like a cowardice he could not accept. He offered her the certainty of steadiness again, quietly, by finishing something he had started without fanfare: the clearing of an old granary as a playroom for the twins, a carved cradle in the corner fashioned by old Pete's sure hands, and an informal agreement to make her both housekeeper and bookkeeper in exchange for wages and lodging. "You take in a life," she said softly the evening he made the offer, "and it's not mine alone." "It's not mine alone either," he answered. "If folks will gossip, let them. I know who holds the measure of my worth." It was not a grand speech. It was a man saying plainly what he intended, that he was prepared to stand by what was right for the children and for the woman who kept their proofs close to her heart. Weston had always been practical. This choice was practical in a different currency, one of courage measured against the cost of reputation. When Victoria's whisperings reached a point where they had the potential to injure, it was not yet a matter for law. It was a matter for small-town cruelty and for the cutting edge of social exclusion. Yet the presence of such a threat also made visible the fragile hinge on which new families swung. Delia, hearing the mutterings and reading the slips of paper in the town's post that carried snippets of gossip, faced a choice no woman of her background wished to parade: to leave before a man of power could be called to decide under law, or to stay and risk being dismantled by procedure and pretense.
Late one evening, after the house had quieted and the moon had skinned the prairie in silver, Delia took the locket and the papers, Samuel's name written in a hand that had once been steady, and considered the possibility of walking away. The thought of the boys raised by another, of the locket buried under a stranger's soil, made her hands tremble. She could not promise no harm would come if Victoria pushed with the cleverness she was known for. Pride whispered that she ought to leave to protect Weston's estate. Love whispered that she should remain, because to leave would be to give up a family that had only just begun. Weston found her on the porch, the horizon outlined like a promise. He did not speak at first. He sat beside her on the bench, feeling the dusk cool the air between them. The ranch in the dark had a sound all its own, the creak of the porch swing, the distant lowing of cattle, the steady snore of a house that trusted its locks. He reached for her hand, and in that small touch offered a steadier answer than any speech. "You keep thinking you must choose their good by casting yourself off," he said. His voice was low, gentle, and free of any theatrics. "I do not ask that of you." Delia turned to him then, and he could see in her eyes the many ways of measuring what a man might ask and what he might mean. "I would not make you the brunt of a scandal," she replied. "You have places to protect, Weston. You have people who count on you." "So do you now," he said simply. "And so do they." There was tenderness in the way he said it, but more than that there was a kind of resolve, like the setting of a fence post in hard ground. They were not lovers yet defined as such by grand gestures. They were people who had begun to see in the other the possibility of a life less hoarded by fear. A week later, a letter arrived from town, not the usual perfunctory note, but a legal-seeming envelope with the county seal. Delia's hands shook as she picked it up. The address on the front bore no handwriting she recognized. Mrs. Henderson hovered, the house in a strange hush. Weston watched the color drain from Delia's face as he slit the envelope with a small, steady knife. Whatever lay inside might be the thing that would either demand a fight or an immediate yielding. He gave her time as she read, though he saw over her shoulder enough to know the paper spoke in the shapes of law, an offer perhaps, or a demand, or a whisper of the sorts of things that men like Victoria would use, insinuation about legitimacy, references to legal instruments that could be used to threaten land or custody. Delia folded the paper and tucked it back in her pocket without a word. "We'll look at it in the morning," he said. He meant it. Men like Weston kept promises by acting, not by rhetorical flourish. He had not planned the fight. He had not planned to be the kind of man who upended his life because of a cry in a field. But when a thing was placed in front of him that bore on the welfare of two small boys and the woman who had saved them from a cold death, he found that he could not be idle. The house settled into its night again as if nothing new had been opened, but on the inside, the care they gave to one another hardened into a small kind of protection. Delia slept with the locket under her pillow. Weston slept with his hand, still remembering the feel of her palm. The twins slept as if the world had decided, at least for a time, not to trouble them again. Outside, the prairie lay vast and patient, as if it could not be hurried. Yet certain things had been set in motion that would not recede. Rumor had its teeth, and law had its claws, and a town's propriety was not inclined to leave a new, chosen family be without taking its first measure. They had time, and they had each other. That would have to be enough for the moment. If this scene moved you, consider subscribing for more stories like this. Morning found the house heavy with a quiet, the way some rooms take to winter, slow and patient. The letter, when Weston opened it at the kitchen table, smelled of a town's ink, and the sort of gravity that made Mrs. Henderson straighten her shoulders and busy her hands with a pot she did not need to stir. It was not a pleading scrap, but a formal notice, the sort that carried the county seal and a lawyer's clipped hand. Victoria Ashworth's name was there like a blade under a glove. It set out in the bland voice of law that certain measures could be taken should Mr. Weston Hale persist in maintaining a household that might, through irregularity, render his estate liable to challenge. There were references to a prior agreement executed in the county clerk's office, an engagement contract cleverly worded, and a request that Weston clarify his legal intentions within 30 days or face proceedings intended to preserve what the Ashworth interest considered the county's proper social order. Delia's fingers closed around the paper the way a woman might close a small private box. She read it again as if some new light might make the threat less real. When Weston asked if she understood it, she only shook her head very slightly. "Mr. Hale," she said at last, looking up in the soft way people do when they must not sound more frightened than they feel, "it names you as the party whose honor
and property are to be considered. That is its craft. Weston's first instinct was the practical one he had used all his life. He would have a lawyer look it over. He would call the man in town who had handled the family's titles for years, a man with spectacles and a steady pen named Mr. Bradford. He would read the words and file answers and make the matter a ledger item, a problem to be closed by careful accounting. But the thing about a letter like that was not merely its legal teeth. It was the voice behind the teeth.
It assumed a power Weston had not thought to exercise in this personal way, the power to determine who ought to be shielded by his name, and who, by reason of past poverty or the absence of a lineage record, might be set aside. Delia rose from the table and walked to the parlor where a small photograph of Samuel sat, the paper mat ragged at the corners. She held the image for a long moment, touching the edge as if the touch could pass what she had been through from one hand to another. The memory that rose, brief and bright as sunlight through a window, was of a Citibank's counting room and Samuel's laugh at the bottom of a ledger. He had been the sort of man who believed a life could be made reasonable by the proper arrangement of figures, who had taught her to regard numbers as friends rather than enemies. He had died 2 winters ago, on a road whose dust never seemed to settle. She had held on to his handwriting and the small silver locket, and the children, and the certainty that what she possessed, however little, was truth. "Whatever is printed in ink," she said at last, "we will answer it with plain speech." They went to town together, Weston in a coat that cinched his shoulders against more than frost, Delia with the locket tucked beneath her blouse and the papers in a box at her feet. In the dim window of Mr. Bradford's office, where ledgers lay open like slow, sleepy animals, the lawyer read the notice with a face that held both interest and a slow, dry humor, not uncommon among men who counted out legal troubles like coins. "It's not outright blackmail," he said, tapping the paper. "It's more threat by implication. Miss Ashworth is very practiced at the art of threat without the rawness of words. She has a document, your engagement contract, Weston, and she's prepared to place it on record in such fashion as might coax a judge to consider whether the mounting of a household such as yours is in the interest of a proper distribution of your estate. It lacks certain force, but its nuisance value is considerable." He leaned back and adjusted his spectacles, then fixed Weston with a look as if to remind him that a man of wealth learned at times that the weight of paper could cut as deeply as a blade. "There are ways to respond," he continued. "Denial, challenge, demonstration of intangible qualities like your present conduct, charitable acts, duties performed, and of course the possibility of countersuit should evidence of impropriety be unearthed regarding Miss Ashworth herself." The name of the method, countersuit, settled in Weston's mind with the same slow certainty as a saddle finding its place. He did not want litigation. He wanted the boys, the house, the quiet that came at night. But he had learned what one did when something menaced the people one kept. One did not cower. He took Bradford's card and asked him to prepare a simple reply, making clear the facts of the household, that the twins were not secreted goods, that Delia had papers proving her marriage and the twins' births, and that Weston at no time had entered into any agreement that bound him in such a way as to forfeit his land for kindnesses rendered. Mr. Bradford nodded and set in motion the small machinery that towns kept for days like these. Yet there were edges to the matter that mere replies would not blunt. Victoria's thrust was social as well as legal. She had been arranging for some months, it seemed, the leaks and the looks that in a small place could make a man suffocate. Weston found himself waking to the sound of the gossip mill, as if it were a distant mill wheel grinding small stones into rumor. He learned of dispatches sent to town editors, the careful way Victoria's acquaintances referred to the twins as found and without sufficient standing. And he saw in certain columns of the county paper a kind of genteel cruelty that would have been merely trifling were it not matched by law's possibility. It was then that Delia sat at her small desk in the office, and for the first time in months allowed herself a memory that was more than the bright echo of Samuel's laugh in a ledger house. She wrote down what she could of Samuel, the long, thin hands that had guided hers over sums, and of the first year of their marriage, when the two of them had scraped by on his stipend, and the small, fierce pride they took when the books matched at the end of the month. She did not write to persuade anyone else. She wrote because she needed, for the first time since she had been alone on the prairie, to keep a record of the person she had been beside Samuel. It studied her, as numbers had once studied him.
At night, she folded the letter from Bradford into her pocket, and Weston would find her on the porch with the twins' small boots in her lap, sewing buttons with hands that had learned to make small things last. "If they come to take the boys," she said once without looking up, "they will need more than words to convince those who have seen me hold them through favor and hunger." "That's why we will not let them take a thing," Weston answered, "nor will I stand aside while a woman decides for me who may call this house home." His voice was that steady thing again, an action spoken through the mouth rather than a declaration in the air. People who heard him, knowing his weight, his hands, his name, felt the tendency of him to protect. But he also felt a new and tender liability, the knowledge that a man loved what he had not expected to love, and would not yield it cheaply. If rumors were the wind, Victoria came like weather. She arrived one morning with a carriage polished enough to hold back questions by its glare. Her dress was the sort that demanded a certain space.
She carried with her a lawyer from the city, whose voice was sharp and dry, like paper creased too often. Her manner at the gate was that of a woman who believed her opinion should be accepted by the land as well as its owners. She looked upon the house with a small, practiced disapproval, like a woman comparing a well-used china cup to the lacquer of a parlor set she had once known. "I understand you have taken in strangers, Mr. Hale," she said with the thin courtesy of someone who considers a life an arrangement to be made neat or unmade as convenience dictates. Weston met her at the porch and answered without heat. "We took in those who needed shelter. They are here by my invitation." "You must understand," Victoria said, stepping forward as if to press the point home. "Such things have consequences. There are those who attend to propriety in our county. My cousin sits on committees relevant to such matters. I would only caution you not to let sentiment eclipse responsibility." There it was again, the insinuation that sentiment carried a moral laxity. Weston's jaw set as if to make note of the insult, not to flare. But the men in his house, old Pete, Cookie, felt it as well, and they looked toward Delia where she stood just inside the doorway, hands folded. Perhaps it was the way Delia did not shrink that made Victoria take more direct action. The social pressure, which might otherwise have cooled, turned into a quicker and crueler thing. Victoria's lawyer produced a copy of a prenuptial agreement between Victoria and Weston, dated the year before. It was a document technical in its phrase, stipulating arrangements should the engagement be dissolved, and Mr. Ashworth, Victoria's counsel, spoke of its legal weight as if that were the end of the matter. Weston's heart gave a small clench at the sight of the paper. He had signed things in the old days without thinking them of importance, agreements and promises made too easily when a man is young, and the world seems to present choices as lines on a map. But he had not imagined the paper would be pulled down like a net to entangle a kindness. Victoria's counsel suggested the agreement could be enforced in such a way as to cut his estate roughly in half, or at the least to subject his decisions to forms and conditions that would make the presence of Delia and the twins problematic. "You underwrite coercion with law," Weston said, his voice cold but steady. "That is not how a man should bind his life." Victoria's smile was a practiced thing. "A man should be accountable, Mr. Hale. That is why I have acted, for the good of your house and the county's moral order." It was not merely the words that stung so much as the attempt to lay upon kindness a price. Delia, who had been taught to keep her head when words cut close, felt a hotness in her chest that was only partly fear. It was shame for the boys and for the fragile shelter they had been given. That evening, she walked in the orchard behind the house and let the night wind unbind some of the tightness of her shoulders. She thought of Samuel's handwriting, of the way he had written numbers like vows, and she worried aloud that some scrap of paper signed in another light might now be used to undo what was right. When she returned to the house, she found old Pete at the workbench, making a small cradle with the careful hands of a man who had made many things when his wife was alive. He gave her a look of companionable defiance, as if to say he had seen many winters and many injustices, and would not be moved by the shouts of a woman with polished shoes. "We'll show them more than words," he said simply, wiping his hands on his apron. There are ways a community keeps faith. The ranch hands came by next morning, not as a force but like curious pillars, each with a story and a memory. Cookie, face still dusted from hay, recalled the day Delia found a mare's nasty abscess and with steady fingers helped the animal through the sickness, saving the colt's life and in doing so preserving much of the ranch's spring foal income. "She's got a hand," Cookie told Weston, turning his cap in his hands, "not just with numbers, but with things that matter.
Mrs. Henderson, who had watched Delia from the beginning and recognized a woman she'd have liked as a daughter, said something that put the matter into the simplest terms. "I've watched that woman nurse a fevered child through a night that would have broke a better woman," she said. "She kept him warm and kept her sense. That is not the work of a person who would bring ruin to a house. It is the work of someone who understands responsibility." Still, rumor and law are not the same thing. Victoria's counsel proffered papers with a certainty that suggested arguments could be bought and sold. A summons was drawn, and the county judge, Morrison, named a day for a preliminary hearing. It was to be held on the porch of the Hale house, practically in the place where the family had made its new home, that the law might see the facts in a location familiar to the county's men. The notice was a thing that should have been a mere formality, but when it was framed by Ashworth's polished face and the presence of a marshal, it began to feel like a metal instrument against a small family's chest. They had 24 hours to marshal their own witnesses and their own proof. Delia spent the daylight hours doing what she had always done, stitching, accounting, moving through the house with the economy of a woman who had learned to be careful about resources. But she also took time to write a letter she did not send, one addressed to a cousin in St. Louis who had once offered assistance, and whose narrow charity had been useful in some small ways. The letter was more for her own steadiness than for expectation.
It contained the facts of Samuel's death and the names on the children's birth certificates, and the quiet account of how she had kept a life for them against odds. She folded the letter and placed it in a drawer with the marriage certificate. It made her feel less naked. Weston went into town and found Mr. Bradford, and, unexpectedly, a man named Jameson, who walked into the tavern where Weston had gone to listen to the talk of the day. Jameson was the Attorney General from the state, a man whose face conformed to the sort of honest gravity that made people trust him even before he had spoken. He had been in the county for reasons of his own, investigating a matter connected to a line of rail finance that had touched certain city interests, and, unexpectedly to Weston, Victoria's late husband. Jameson's visit was the sort of coincidence the county kept in its pockets like coins. He said he had heard of a dispute at Hale Ranch and wished to see if the state could be of service. His eyes were quick and bright, as a man who had read more than his share of legal traps. "What would the state have to do with a domestic dispute?" Weston asked, surprised. Jameson smiled a small, dry smile. "The state's business is often to see the small affairs of men kept honest. I have reason to believe there are ties between Miss Ashworth's late husband and certain financial improprieties, loans poorly recorded, funds shifted in ways that require inquiry. If she is using documents derived from that mischief to coerce a man into surrender of property, then the state has an interest in the matter." It was the sort of sentence that made sense in the long way law finds itself connected. A line of men and money can trip over itself into a present wrong. Jameson explained carefully that he had received certain affidavits from a city clerk who had been troubled by odd entries in the books of the railroad company, entries that had, in part, involved a man whose name was Ashworth. The clerk had confided in Jameson that some pages had been altered and other notes had been added later. "If papers are being used to bully folks in the country," Jameson said, "we will want to know whose hand wrote them." That night, the Hale house's porch was a hive of practical minds. Old Pete and Cookie and Mrs. Henderson sat in council with Weston and Delia, not to spin fantasies, but to list deeds and favors, and to write down the names of those who could speak to Delia's care of the children, and to the honest rest of the people she had fed and tended. Weston himself resolved to gather the records of the ranch's accounts to show that the household was not a fraud, but a place of industry and care. Delia, who always kept a careful hand, prepared a small bundle of the original documents, the marriage certificate, the children's birth records, and the small ledger entry she had made in Samuel's hand, that would, she hoped, be sufficient to show the truth. Morning arrived with the lean light of the prairie and a small parade down the lane. Victoria with her lawyer, Judge Morrison with a dull judicial face, a marshal named Crawford who radiated the sort of authority that did not require bellows, and a few townsfolk who thought the spectacle of a porch trial proper morning entertainment. Weston met them at the gate like a man in a field. The sun struck the boards of the porch with a flat, judicial light. Victoria's voice in the opening moments was cool as frost. She presented her papers with the mincing pains of a woman rehearsed to scold. "This household," she said, letting the word hang like an accusation, "may be the site of an arrangement that imperils what is rightly the county's regard for its citizens. I ask only that the court consider whether those children are in safe and proper hands, and whether the gentleman of the house is prepared to affirm his intentions." When Weston rose to answer, he did so in the way he always had, measured, without glare. "This household is as it appears," he said. "Women and children who were without shelter are now given refuge. The children have papers proving their births, and a mother who has kept them with honor. If there are grievances, let them be brought with fact rather than insinuation." The early moments of the hearing did little to change the balance. Victoria's lawyer was artful, moving from the implication of impropriety to the suggestion that some prior agreement might be enforceable. He spoke of legal precedent with a sort of technicality that left the air narrow and difficult. Yet as the town had come to watch the drama, other voices rose among the crowd, voices of those who had walked with Delia a time or two and found in her an honest and steady person. Mrs. Henderson came forward and told of the night she had found the twins fevered, and how Delia had kept vigil through hours that might have taken them, and of how the mother's management of the house had turned panic into the gentle hum of remedy. Old Pete recounted a time when, during a blizzard, Delia had coaxed men and babes alike through a night with a rationed loaf and a steady hand. Cookie told of how she had once taken in a broken colt and nursed it with the same tenderness she gave to children. One by one, the ranch hands gave small, specific accounts. They did not speak in generalities, but in particulars. The night Delia had found the mare, the day she had stayed by Tommy's side when he had cut his hand on a barbed nail, the week she had taken stock of supplies and stretched feed so that no animal or person lacked. Their words were small and human and lodged in the mind as proofs that could not easily be erased by legal phrase. Then Jameson stood. He had been quiet for most of the morning, listening, and now he spoke with a calm that suggested a man who had seen the way law could be misused and had come prepared to unmask it.
He had with him a packet of documents he had gathered in the city, letters between certain railroad managers, and a clerk's confession that some entries had been fabricated, an accounting showing transfers of money into accounts that bore the name of Victoria's late husband, and then had been moved through channels that suggested a design to conceal. "These are not allegations meant to besmirch a widow," Jameson said. "They are records that indicate a man associated with Miss Ashworth, the late Mr. Ashworth, had dealings that left certain debts unsettled. There is evidence that those who stood to gain from those unsettled matters now seek to recover by other means. There are affidavits afoot that show payment and misrepresentation. If papers in this county were altered or manufactured to coerce, we will not have that stand as a lawful practice." There was a small stir in the crowd. Victoria's face, which had been a picture of composed superiority, tightened. Her lawyer protested the relevance of matters that occurred in another county and another context. But Jameson, with his packet of evidence, and a careful retelling of the chain by which the money moved, made a reasonable man see the line between the Ashworth money games and the present attempt to profit by privation. It was the sort of chain that could be followed by a judge, and that turned an insinuation into an investigation. Judge Morrison, a man more apt to speak slowly than to overreach, considered the matter with deliberate care. He ruled that the preliminary claim of immediate custody could not be maintained without more proof, and that any attempt to use an old engagement contract to strip Weston of land would require further hearing in a court of proper venue. He admonished Victoria to present any documentary claims to the clerk's office for inspection, and to refrain from any immediate action that might displace the children before a fuller hearing could be held. It was, in legal terms, a small victory. In human terms, it was a reprieve. The court's decision allowed the family to remain where they were, and it gave them breathing room to contest the claims with facts rather than rumor. Yet there was a cost of exposure. Victoria, cornered, began to push harder in the margins, seeking allies and hints of a technicality that might yet be used. The days became a pattern of work and waiting. Delia went about the house with a new form of resilience, careful, steady, and willing to let men speak on her behalf when needed. Weston was a physical presence at her side, both in the office and in the small domestic rituals that had come to stitch them closer, the folding of quilts, the waking to the twins' small hands finding his face in the morning. He had come, by his own admission, to measure a man's life not solely by acres, but by the capacity to keep another human warm at night. And then Victoria's final move arrived like winter's last cold. She presented an amended suit, this time with a more pointed allegation, that Delia had not been fully candid about her past, that there were inconsistencies in record, and that such inconsistencies were grounds for temporary guardianship under the county's laws should a judge find that a child's welfare might be in question. She did not say outright that she sought to take the children, but the implication was clear. If she could secure temporary custody, she would be in a position to force a settlement. Delia's fingers trembled as she gathered the children into her lap upon hearing the news, folding them as if to hold their small hearts against her own. She prepared to make a choice she had avoided, to leave so the boys' names and the ranch might be secure, to go quietly back to the relative in town and live under their protection. The thought of leaving the house she had come to love made her nearly sick.
Yet the thought of causing Weston to lose the land he had kept, and the men who might lose their work, seemed a cruelty she could not inflict. Weston would not have it. He found her on the porch, hand in hand with old Pete, and he sat down beside them as the day leaned toward dusk. "There is a way to answer them," he said simply. "We will not scuttle away because a woman in town believes paper has more value than a man's life. We will stand." "But if they take them," Delia whispered, looking away. "They will not," he answered, "not while I draw breath." There are moments in life when courage is not a thing shouted, but a thing done. Weston prepared to defend his family with his name on the line. He wrote letters to men of reputation in the county, calling in favors not as debts but as mutual pledges. He asked old Pete and Cookie to gather witnesses. He called Mr. Bradford to prepare the documentary defense. He also asked, quietly, that Mrs. Henderson and the ranch hands prepare their statements for the judge. That they did so with small heaps of memory and certain details, testimonies about nights wrought in care, about how Delia had kept the household in order, made the case less a contest of law than a defense of the apparent and the true. On the day of the hearing, the house was full. Neighbors came not as spectators only, but as friends. Mr. Jameson returned with his packet of city documents and the statements he had taken from the clerk whose conscience had been pricked. The clerk's affidavit was a small bombshell. He recounted, in a hand that trembled with the courage of such things, that certain pages were struck out and others inserted under the instruction of one who had motive to make the books look different. He could not be certain of all the details, but he was certain enough to make a judge pause. Victoria, when pressed about the origins of her documents, found her composure fraying. The letters Jameson produced showed payments into accounts that bore Mr.
Ashworth's cipher and subsequent transfers, whose destinations were odd and unaccounted for. There was evidence that a small circle of individuals in the city had profited from the confusion, and it suggested motive. If a man had lost money in the railroad dealings and others moved to blame him or shift liabilities by compulsion, then the present attempt to claim Weston's land looked less like propriety and more like a crooked recovery. Under cross-examination, Victoria's assertions about Delia's past began to appear as the thin shell they were. Witnesses, neighbors from the route the wagon had taken, testified to the sight of a woman traveling alone with 2 children, and to the days Delia had worked in a small office in town to stretch a life. A clerk from the St. Louis bank, called in by Jameson to verify some of Samuel's signatures, confirmed the marriage certificate's authenticity, while noting that the handwriting matched ledgers Samuel had kept. The small authenticity of a woman's life in ink began to push back against the polished insinuations Victoria had offered. As the hearing wound toward late afternoon, a moment came that would be remembered in the house for its ordinariness. Weston rose and addressed the court with the ease of a man who had been schooled in the art of practical speech. He did not fling declarations, nor did he seek to make law his weapon. Instead, he spoke of the nights he had watched Jaime's fever ebb, and of how Delia had sat with the child until dawn, and then had gone to her desk and kept accounts that preserved the very bread the table ate. He spoke of the men who had relied on the ranch for work, and how the presence of the twins had turned that work into a home. His voice, when he said that the house would not be surrendered to rumor and coercion, carried the weight of his life. Judge Morrison listened, his face a map of judicial restraint, and then spoke with a measured firmness. He would not allow a child's welfare to be used as a weapon in a quarrel among adults. Until proof of actual neglect was demonstrated, which the evidence in the hearing had not supported, the children were to remain in the care of their mother and in the custody of Weston for the protection of the household. He awarded the state's representative, Jameson, permission to continue inquiries into the allegations of fraud he had raised, and he admonished Victoria for bringing a suit without fuller documentation. This court, he said, will not countenance the manufacture of misfortune to secure advantage. Victoria left with the thin face of a woman who thought matters would bend her way. In the days that followed, Jameson's investigation into Mr. Ashworth's affairs deepened. Letters were traced more carefully. Bank ledgers were examined by men who knew the art of accounting. A city clerk who had been paid hush money came forward with an oath and a small resignation that signaled his unwillingness to carry further lies.
The chain Jameson had suspected, payments, transfers, false entries, was not wholly undone overnight, but enough of it came to light to make Victoria's case look like a predatory thing rather than a righteous one. Confronted with the possibility that her late husband's network had been part of a scheme to manipulate property, and that her own actions had descended into the same murky waters, Victoria found herself at a pivot. She hired counsel more aggressively, and for a time the county papers filled with speculation about how a woman of her standing would never stoop to such measures. But as Jameson's pile of evidence sat on the county desk, the tenor of talk shifted. The man who had once seemed to be the arbiter of social taste found himself the subject of suspicion. That shift changed the county's balance of opinion. Men who had once been tempted to the polite cruelty of sending a letter or letting a rumor slide now spoke in Weston's favor. They told of the small things Delia had done that saved them money and kept them employed. They recounted how the twins laughed and made the ranch a place of ease instead of just a site of labor. The community's testimony, once a rustle of gossip, became a chorus. Dignity, it seems, has a way of prevailing when offered and defended by those who see it carried in flesh and in deed. When the danger had passed most immediately, there remained smaller reckonings, a formal recognition of the family's status in the county, the legal adoption they would seek so that the boys' names would be unambiguous in the public record, and a private conversation between Weston and Delia about the life they wished to make together. It was not a pressing declaration of love in fever and grand gesture. It was instead a simple offering. Weston, who had seen what Delia had carried, asking if she would stay by a different arrangement, to make her part of his household not just in duty but in legal and social right. They chose a quiet afternoon for the matter, a time when the winds lay low and the house smelled of bread and the twins' small soap. Weston had never been one for florid speeches. He took from his pocket a small scrap of paper, an agreement he had asked Mr. Bradford to prepare, and he set it before Delia. It was not a grand contract, but the matter-of-fact instrument of a man who would not rely on rumor or reasoning, but on the law's gentle machinery to make sure a life came to be acknowledged for the good it had done. "Will you be my wife?" he asked in the plain way of their life, folding his hands as if to make the words less ostentatious and why like a practical vow. Delia looked at him, at the ridged hands calloused by work, at the man who had ridden into a hollow to save 2 children, who had kept his word through a fever, who had stood like a fence post against gossip. She placed the silver locket into his palm. Inside was the photograph of Samuel and the twins and the italic curl of an earlier life.
"I will," she said at last, "not because it will make our papers whole, but because I have found that the hardest things, raising a child, keeping books, are better done with a companion." They were married not in a cathedral, but in a small room in town where a minister with a warm face and a firm voice asked whether any present objected. No one did. Mrs. Henderson prepared a meal afterward that took up the better part of a table and turned the affair into one of celebration rather than ceremony. Old Pete carved a wooden spoon with the initials of the couple and the twins' names on the handle, small tokens of the sort that last longer than silver if the right hands use them. The adoption followed the marriage in the court, where Judge Morrison sat with a quicker smile than he allowed himself in public. The papers were signed in a blunt, legal hand that made something secret public, that Weston did indeed choose these boys for his own. The clerk stamped the ink, and the world conformed in the way legal acknowledgement makes possible. For Delia, who had kept the documents of Samuel and the children tucked against her heart for fear the world might doubt, the signing of these new pages felt like a settling of dust into place. Months passed in the new rhythm of a house that had been fought for and saved. Winters came and went, and spring painted the prairie with the small green hope of things returning. Delia returned to the ledger with an ease that made Weston admire her in a new light. Together they found efficiencies in feed and bookkeeping that stitched small savings into good stewardship. The twins, now safer in their sleep and bold in their play, ran the house with that candid authority of children who know they are loved. Sometimes Tommy would climb into Weston's lap and call him simply Dad, as if the word had always been as simple as bread. Jamie, lean with the kind of quickness that made him look as if he might take flight, would stand by Delia's knee while she balanced the accounts, watching the ink like a child watching a small miracle. There were small, ordinary rituals that sealed the life they'd made. Weston, who once had assigned value by acreage, took to sketching a small portrait of the house and its occupants. No grand oil painting, but a humble charcoal that hung above the mantel and showed the Hale house with 2 small figures in front of it and a man at the door. Old Pete carved a cradle that sat beside the bed and creaked like a lullaby, while Cookie taught the twins to tie a knot that would hold in wind and in good weather alike. And in time there came the news that made the household bright in a way different from the sun. Delia was with child. The revelation was not flung from a rooftop, but whispered by Mrs. Henderson over tea, and the house filled with a pleasure that had nothing to do with ledger balance or law. It was a life, small and uncertain, that made them all move more gently.
Weston took to walking the fields with the twins and telling them nothing of the worries that once had stalked their days. The idea of a new life, of a child born into a house that had been chosen and fought for, made the yard seem larger and the future less formidable. Victoria's fortunes dwindled in the slow way of someone who had burned her social bridges through overreach. The investigations Jameson had carried into the city produced the proofs that made her maneuvers appear at best desperate, at worst complicit with fraud. Her name became attached to the wrong sort of scandal, one born of reckoning more than of rumor, and the society that had once opened doors now found them closing with polite efficiency. She departed the county soon after, her departure the subject of little poetry and much small gossip that was kinder to say than to be. The ranch settled into a steadier time. There were still times when memory of the early fear visited Delia, and when the faint sting of gossip returned like an old bruise. But each time the house responded with the steady talisman of proof, the small portraits in the locket, the ledger that balanced, the signatures of a judge and a clerk that said plainly, "These boys have a place." Community testimony had been their shield, and in time the county's gossip grew kinder because the children's laughter and the small facts of their lives would not be denied. 6 months after the adoption and the marriage, the Hale house seemed to be breathing out for the first time in a long time. The porch swing held 3 small figures in the late afternoon, as the sun slid slow and copper across the prairie. Mrs. Henderson had arranged a small portrait session. A local woman who painted with oils had come and set the family in a way that made their life look as if it had always been this way. The portrait was a study in contentment. Weston stood behind the chair, his hand on Delia's shoulder, his jaw soft with a man who had learned the shape of a better life. Delia held Jamie on her lap, Tommy balanced on the arm of the chair, chin against his mother's cheek. The painted locket shone faintly at Delia's throat. In the corner of the painting, old Pete's cradle was suggested by a streak of shadow. The sky above the house was the low, vast blue that had always been the prairie's promise. They did not pretend the world had been perfect. There had been nights of worry, and there would be future trials, the sorts that come with sickness, with bad weather, with the simple, lifelong work of keeping a household going in a land that allowed no rest. But the portrait did something else. It made a record visible of a life that had been chosen and made by work and by courage. That was the better sort of document. In the evenings, when the work was done and the children slept with chests that rose and fell in small, quiet rhythms, Weston would go to the office and sit by the ledger. He would trace a column with his finger and think of the way a ruler's hand can make sense of the world. Delia would come and stand behind him, her cool hand on the back of his chair, and together they would look out at fields that they had both helped to tend. Often she would open the locket and touch the photograph of Samuel, not in sorrow but in recognition that a life once shared had left imprints that helped them anchor the new. One night, as winter softened to thaw, they sat on the porch and listened to the wind move over the prairie in long, slow breaths. The twins slept in their small beds, and the cradle creaked like a lullaby not yet needed. Delia set her head against Weston's shoulder and said, softly, "You heard them cry, and you came. You could have ridden on." He smiled, the kind of small, private smile that belonged to their life now. "I could not," he said simply, "and I am glad I did." There was a truth in that moment that needed no proclamation. A sound had altered the course of a man's life, and that man had chosen to keep the change. It had not been a clean story. There had been fear and law and gossip, and a woman who tried to make mischief out of misfortune. But in the end, the thing that mattered had been the slow accumulation of small acts. The bread baked at the stove, the ledger entries made with a careful hand, the vigil kept through the fever, the testimony of neighbors. These were the proofs that would outlast any paper born on rumor. The ranch, in its daily round, continued. There were other days of trouble, droughts that worried the herd, fences that needed mending, storms that demanded whole days of work. But the house's rhythm had altered so that such things were tasks to be met rather than threats to the family. The twins grew with a boldness that made Delia's chest ache with a fierce kind of love, and Weston learned the smallness of patience in the hands of a man who had once measured his life in acres and now measured it in afternoons spent teaching a boy to hold a rope. When the spring finally came,
bringing with it a swelling warmth and the echo of birds. The family gathered in the yard and set a new baby's cradle beneath the porch. It was old Pete's finest work yet. He had carved the rails with a steady, unashamed hand. They placed the cradle as one might place a promise. If the county's papers ever wrote of a rich cowboy who heard two children cry and thereby discovered the secret their mother kept, they would be only partially honest. Weston had indeed heard a cry that altered his path, but the true secret was not merely the locket or the papers. It was the small dignity Delia had kept against the world, and the courage of the people who stood with them when that dignity was challenged. A secret, after all, is often less a concealment than a trust, protected until such time as its keeping might save someone.
The house at Hale Ranch, in the light of a late afternoon, looked as if it had always been a place for children. The twins played with a wooden horse beneath the watchful eye of Mrs. Henderson, and somewhere within the walls, the sound of a new life's small stirring reminded them why they had chosen to fight. Weston watched Delia as she tied a small sash on a child's coat, and he felt in his chest the steady, slow swell of a man who had been given a second kind of harvest, that of a family. If anyone in the county wondered at the man who had once been measured by his acres alone, they might see now that his wealth had become harder to count. It was measured in the sound of children's laughter, in a ledger that balanced bread for the table and blankets for the bed, and in the community that had stood before rumor and law to say plainly what it knew, that goodness worth having is sometimes created by unlooked-for accidents, and then kept by the courage to defend it. So the house stood, the cradle rocked, and the locket dangling against Delia's heart caught the light and sent a small, private shine across the porch boards, proof in small metal and ink that what was kept had worth. And when evening came, and the prairie breathed out its long, cool breath beneath the stars, Weston and Delia sat together and listened to the steady sound of their life, a sound made up of many small things, of ledgers balanced, of meals shared, of a woman who had hidden papers beneath her pillow, not to deceive but to protect, and of a man who had heard a cry and chosen to answer. If you were moved by this tale, like and share, and if you'd care for another story of quiet courage and chosen family, please watch the next one linked at the end.